Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Near Death podcast, where we talk about life, death and experiences in between. I'm Kirsty, the host of the show, and I trust that the conversations within this podcast will offer value, insight and information into what happens in the afterlife. To find out more about the free online community and extra content, be sure to click subscribe and to check out the links in the notes below. And now, let's get into today's episode.
And from that perspective, when I was like 20 or 30 feet above my body, I could see that there was a train rapidly coming into the station. Always, all my life, I've always clearly remembered floating above the accident scene and watching, looking down below. At the same time, it was like I was transformed into a force field of love. All of a sudden, I feel like this force field of peace descend upon me.
Hello and welcome back to the Let's Talk Near Death podcast, where we talk about life, death and experiences somewhere in between. Our guest today is Dr. Yvonne Kason, who has had 5 near-death experiences, 2 as a child and 3 in her adult life. She's had multiple spiritually transformative experiences, or STEs as you may know them. She's a retired family physician and a psychotherapist and the Past-President of IANDS, the International Association of Near-Death Studies. Dr. Kason was the person to coin the phrase a spiritually transformative experience. That was in 1990. And was the first Canadian medical doctor to specialise her medical practice in the research and counselling of patients of diverse types of STEs. She has 40 years' experience counselling STE experiences, and she co-founded the Kundalini Research Network in 1990. She has published 5 books, the recent one being Touched by the Light, Exploring Spiritually Transformative Experiences in 2019. Today, Yvonne is doing amazing work. She's the president and the co-founder of Spiritual Awakenings International, and she's the co-leader and co-founder of Toronto Awakenings Sharing Group. She's doing some incredible work on the ground, running conferences, engaging with people from all over the place around their spiritually transformative experiences. And I know that we're going to get to talking about that within our conversation today. So Dr. Yvonne Kason, welcome to the Let's Talk Near Death podcast.
Thank you. Wonderful for you to have me.
You're doing some amazing work, especially with Spiritual Awakenings International. Excellent work that you have been doing. You've got years and years of research behind you. You've got all of your experiences, whether they're NDEs or STEs, and I know there's actually a whole lot more in there for us to hear about. Where do we start this conversation? You had your first experience as a child. Is that where we start?
You know, it's true. I had 2 near-death experiences as a child, but I never realized they were near-death experiences until much, much, much later in my life. Children, you don't have a barometer to judge. Is this normal? Is this paranormal? And so I just thought, well, I guess this happens to other people. So it's only really about 3 years ago that I realized that I, in fact, had 2 near-death experiences as a child. So I'll just very briefly tell you those, but then I'll get to the ones that happened when I was in my 20s. And that's when I really started becoming aware of there's more to life and to consciousness and to us than what I had been taught. So when I was 5 years old, I was traveling with my parents in Europe, and I was almost hit by a train. And what happened was we were standing at a platform, and I'd never actually traveled by train before. In Canada, we don't travel by train very much. In Europe, they do all the time. And I was standing on a platform and waiting for the train with my parents. And I saw, I guess, a station hand of some sort jump off the platform down onto the tracks, run across and climb up on the next platform. Now, as a 5-year-old, I thought, oh, that looks like fun. So I immediately made up my mind that I was going to jump on the tracks and run across onto the next platform. So I leaned over, and to me, it felt like I was on a 45-degree angle, already like part way into jumping down on the tracks, and time stood still. All of a sudden, time stood still, and I found myself maybe 20 or 30 feet above my body, and me and my thinking was still moving, but it was like my life was a motion picture and had frozen at that frame, so everything was still except for me. I could still think. And from that perspective, when I was like 20 or 30 feet above my body, I could see that there was a train rapidly coming into the station. I had not looked both ways before I jumped on the tracks. And I could see from up there, oh, there's a train. I'm about to be hit by a train. And I had absolutely no fear. I was in this really extraordinary calmness, witnessing that, oh, my body's about to be hit by a train. I mean, you'd think normally there'd be an emotional reaction, but there wasn't. And then all of a sudden, somebody from the platform grabbed me from behind and pulled my physical body back onto the platform. And so then all of a sudden I'm back in my physical body and I'm on the platform, and woo, with a whoosh of air, the train, whizzed in front of me. So I was not hit by the train. I was pulled out in time. So my parents, of course, scolded me. But I never realized as a 5-year-old that I had experienced anything that we would call paranormal. But what I do remember is, because it was the summer before I started kindergarten, and when I made some new friends in kindergarten, I remember telling one of my new friends, I can fly, and no, you can't. I said, sure I can, because that is how I understood what had happened that day. What I now know was an out-of-body experience. I thought as a 5-year-old that I could fly, and that because I could fly was why I was not hit by the train. And I remember climbing up on the fence in front of my house and by the gate there, stretching out my arms like this and jumping off, thinking that I would be able to fly down the street and show my new friend that I could fly. And of course, I just fell down to the ground. And I still remember so clearly my reaction, because I was puzzled. I was confused. I couldn't figure out why I couldn't fly when I had such a clear memory of what I thought was flying. So now, all these years later, I realized, oh my goodness, that was a near-death experience when I went out of body when I was facing death. And so my second near-death experience that I now realize was a near-death experience that, once again, I did not realize when I was a child, happened when I had just turned 11. So this was still, a year or two before puberty. I was really still just a little kid. And my entire family was involved in a very serious car accident. We were on the highway driving, and then flat tire, and then we went into a deep embankment, and the car spun over a few times. And anyway, I ended up as a little 11-year-old, flung into the back of this big station wagon with the luggage, and I had a head injury, and I was unconscious for 3 days following this car accident. And I've always remembered, like always, all my life, I've always clearly remembered floating above the accident scene and looking down below, and I could see my dad, and my dad was covered in blood, and he was saying, my daughter, because they hadn't found my body in the back of the car yet, and he had noticed that I hadn't been found. And then I also have always remembered, and still remember to this day, in the emergency department, when they took us to the emergency department, I could see, it was like I was up by the ceiling, or that the ceiling had gone transparent, and I could look down and I could see my bed on the little, the table, the examining table they have in emergency departments. And I could see two men sort of huddled over my body, examining it. I'm guessing they're doctors who were trying to resuscitate me or assess my injuries. And I remember I could see from the top down view, those big, long, round, disc-shaped lamps. So I could see the big disc-shaped lamp that was over where they were examining my body. And now that I'm older, and now that I'm a doctor, yes, I know that's what operating room or emergency room lamps look like. But as an 11-year-old, I had no idea what they looked like. And I was seeing it from the top down perspective, that I was like made where the ceiling should be, that I was watching it. And I also clearly remember the moment that I woke up. And again, as an 11-year-old, I had no idea this didn't happen to everybody when they had a head injury or they were unconscious. I had no idea that this was, quotes, paranormal. So I never framed it as something paranormal. I never even talked about it because I thought that was what happened to everybody. But, when I look back now, the other interesting thing was, for about a year after that accident, after that head injury, I could see ghosts. And I would see spirits in my house at night. And I remember I was afraid to sleep in my own bedroom. As a child, how I understood that was I thought my house was haunted. And I told my parents that I thought our house was haunted. And, they thought probably it was just stress from the car accident or something like that. But really, I could see spirits and they frightened me. And I insisted on them moving my bed. I had my own bedroom by that age, but I insisted they move my bed in with my brother and my sister because I was too scared when I would see these spirits at night. I wanted to be in the room with somebody else. And so now, as I look back as an adult and as someone who's been researching near-death experiences and other STEs for 40 years, I can see that, oh my goodness, that was a near-death experience when I was in the car accident at the age of 11. And that was an after effect of the near-death experience that opened me up psychically so that I could see ghosts for a year afterwards. And then that after effect went away and I more or less went back to normal. But again, as a child, I had no idea this was paranormal. It was just what had happened to me. And I really didn't talk about it. And what really woke me up to the whole, the reality of the whole spectrum of what I termed that phrase, spiritually transformative experiences, happened a little later in my life, happened in my 20s. So it actually started before my first adult near-death experience. Back in 1976, I was in my last year of medical school, and I had a very strong STE in my last year of medical school. And what happened was that they had a group teaching meditation courses at the university, and they were advertising that if you took this meditation course, it would help you relax if you meditated, and you would do better on your exams and you could study better. And of course, being in my last year of medical school, there was a lot of pressure and a lot of exams. So I thought, okay, I'm going to take this course and see if it's going to help me do well on my exams. And so I'm just saying that because I had no thought about, having a transcendental experience. I was really doing it to try and do better on my exams and do better with my studying. Anyway, I took this meditation course and I really loved it. I discovered I loved meditating. It felt like a shoe that fit, or a duck being led to water for the first time. It was, I like this. I can do this. And so I started meditating every day, like maybe almost an hour in the morning, hour in the evening. Really enjoyed my meditations. And they did help me do well on my exams, and they did help me be calm to study. But about 3 months after I started meditating regularly, it was in December of 1976, I had this really powerful experience where all of a sudden I heard this inner roaring noise, like the roar of a waterfall. And then I felt this really strong energy, like a physical energy, rise up my body and spine and then up through the top of my head. And then I went out of body and I expanded. My point of perception went up maybe 20, 30 feet above where I was sitting meditating. And what I think of as me was no longer the size of my body. I had expanded to this vast space. I was in an auditorium doing a group meditation, and it felt like I filled the whole auditorium, the me that filled the whole auditorium. And then at the same time, it was like I was transformed into a force field of love. I felt this really beautiful love. And, being naive and inexperienced in all sorts of STEs, how I understood it at the time was, wow, no wonder people love to meditate. Because I thought that all the experienced meditators were getting this experience all the time, right? And I was actually sort of embarrassed afterwards. I thought, gosh, it took me 3 months to figure out how to get my technique right. Not going to tell anybody. Seriously, I was embarrassed because I thought, I'm this top student in medical school and I'm a slow learner in meditation, So anyway, I didn't even tell anybody for a long time. But so I stayed in that expansive state of love and out of body until my meditation ended. And then I contracted back down into my body. But it wasn't happening when I tried to meditate again. And I couldn't figure out, was I doing something wrong with my technique or something? So I finally, tail between my legs, sort of embarrassed, I went up to one of the meditation leaders, maybe it's several weeks afterwards, and said, I must be doing something wrong with my technique. How come I'm not having that experience every time I meditate? And then they listened to my story, and I remember the leader, his jaw dropped, like, what? That happened to you? And I said, yeah. Like, that was my first clue that it wasn't happening to everybody.
Yeah.
And then he says, well, I don't know what that is. The only thing it sounds like is a Kundalini awakening, but could it possibly be a Kundalini awakening? You're far too young. You're much too inexperienced as a meditator. And you have to have been meditating for 40 years and you have to be with a guru and blah, blah, blah. So he was telling me all the reasons it could not have been a Kundalini awakening, but he didn't know what it was, but it sounded like a Kundalini awakening.
Isn't it interesting?
Anyway, yeah. So now I know many, many, many years later, it was indeed a Kundalini awakening. And so I started after that experience to have after effects from that, where I would have recurrent rushes of energy up my spine and inner sounds, etc. But just because of time today, I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. So I also wonder if this sort of primed the pump in me, that I'd had these two near-death experiences as a child. And then I have this Kundalini awakening for what happened when I was in my residency, which was my first adult near-death experience. And that changed the course of my entire life. So what happened? That happened on March 27th, 1979. And I was already a young medical doctor at that time. And I was finishing my residency, my specialty training in family medicine. And I had been assigned for a month to work in remote regions of Northern Ontario, Canada, with some of the Native Indian communities up there. And on this particular day, I was assigned on a medevac and a medical evacuation. And it was going to be done by airplane rather than by ambulance. And so I was to accompany a critically ill Native Indian woman. There was a nurse with me as well in the plane and a pilot. And we were flying in a very small twin propeller airplane called a Piper Aztec. And we were flying this critically ill woman from the little hospital where I was working to a larger hospital in a larger community, a larger city, Winnipeg, because they had an ICU facilities there that could deal with her deteriorating condition. Anyway, so to make a long story short enough to fit into your podcast, but if people are interested, I want to just point out, this is my book, Touched by the Light. And all 5 of my near-death experiences are in there. And also over about 100 case stories of different people over the years who've told me about their various types of STEs. So, but
fabulous. We'll put the link to that in the show notes that people can go and have a look at that. Perfect.
Thank you. But anyway, so I'll just, because of time, I'll give you the key points of the near-death experience in 1979. What I now know was a near-death experience. But again, for almost 10 years afterwards, I didn't know it was a
Yeah,
near-death
right.
experience. I didn't have a
Wow.
word for it. So anyway, what happened that particular day is where I was on this medevac and we were transporting this critically ill woman, and I was quite busy. She was intubated, which means she had one of those tubes in her airway, and there was this bag called an ambu bag that I had to be manually contracting to keep her breathing. We had an oxygen tank flowing with oxygen. She had a couple of intravenous's with drugs and fluids, and the nurse was tending to her 2 intravenous's, one in each arm. And the pilot was obviously flying the plane, and it's a very small plane of Hyper Aztec. So there was the pilot in the front. The co-pilot seat is where we had the oxygen tank. And then the patient was behind the pilot. The seats had been taken out, and basically the length of her stretcher took her to the rear of the plane. That's how small the plane was. And then I was in the seat behind the co-pilot. The seat behind me was the nurse, and then that was the back of the plane. So it was a tiny little plane. And so we flew from Sioux Lookout, was where we were flying from. And we were flying towards Winnipeg. It should have been about an hour, but we flew into bad weather. This was still the middle of winter in that part of Ontario, Canada. And we flew into a bad blizzard, bad storm. And so we were really being buffeted by turbulence, and it was dark and it was stormy. And then all of a sudden, I could hear, because if you've ever been in a propeller plane, you know that the propellers are loud. They're really noisy.
Oh,
So
yeah.
you can hear when they're going. So all of a sudden, because I was tending to the patient, I could hear that the sound of the propeller to the right had changed. It was stopped roaring and it was sputtering to a stop. And so I looked out the window and I could see that engine, the propeller, was slowly coming to a stop. We were only flying on one engine. And I thought, oh my goodness, what's going on? So I shouted up to the pilot, what's happening? What's going on? And he was pushing levers and buttons and pulling stuff. And you could see he was desperately trying to do something. And he managed to get the engine restarted. And so, okay, then I stopped worrying. And then I went back to tending to the patient with my full attention. And then a few minutes later, again, I hear the sound of the engines change, but this time it's the left engine, it's the other engine, and it was now sputtering to the stop. And so we were only going on the one engine that had failed before. And so again, I shout up to the pilot, like, what's going on? What's going on? And he's again, pushing levers and doing this and doing all sorts of stuff, obviously trying to do something to get the plane going properly. Anyway, to make a long story short, they did an inquiry. They are assuming that what's happened is that the air filters of both of the engines froze over one after the other. You know how now when you fly, I don't know if they do in New Zealand, but up here they de-ice planes in the winter because it's a bad thing when ice gets into the motor. So anyway, the ice had gotten into they said the air filters of the motors, and that's why first one engine, then the other engine failed. And he was trying to do some sort of an emergency landing somewhere. He'd been in contact with somewhere on radio. Where's the closest landing strip? Well, it was pretty far away. And anyway, there's an incredible heroic story of how he was trying to get us down safely as we were losing our engines, but he could not get us to the closest airport or runway or anything. And so what ended up happening is then all of a sudden we were without any engines and the plane was going down. Now he had steered the plane in this part of Canada. It's very, very, very hilly and fully forested. But there are also a lot of lakes, and the lakes were all frozen because it was winter. So he had been steering the plane to get us over lakes so that if we came down, he was going to try and do like a guided belly landing on the surface of a frozen lake rather than crashing into trees where we would have blown up and been killed. And anyway, so he's guiding this plane, and I could see what he's trying to do, but the plane was just being buffeted by the wind and with no engines. And what happened was I just felt this incredible fear and panic. And it was obvious we were crashing. And out of my heart, it was just like a reflex. Out of my heart came the thought, oh God, help, I'm going to die. And I think that was close enough to a prayer that is when my near-death experience began. It actually began before the plane crashed. So in this
wow.
incredible panic and fear and this horrible turbulence and the pilot trying to keep us from hitting the trees, all of a sudden, I feel like this force field of peace descend upon me.
Mm.
And it's literally like it's pushing away all of my fear. And then I hear a voice in my mind say, be still and know that I am God.
Oh, wow. Wow.
I am with you now and always. And those words, they just permeated my soul with this really powerful sense of peace and sense of that whether I lived or died, that everything would be okay. And I was totally unafraid. And I turned and I started comforting the patient. She had regained consciousness. I remember I was saying to her, she's looking at me with her eyes, it's going to be all right. Nothing to be afraid of. Because I somehow knew that even if we died in the crash, it was going to be okay. There was nothing to be afraid of with this incredible sort of mystical peace that has descended upon me.
The Let's Talk Near Death podcast is excited to be a co-sponsor of the upcoming Spiritual Awakenings International Conference. Taking place on June the 12th and 13th in 2021, this is a conference to bring us together as a global spiritual family. To find out more information about this conference and how you can get your ticket, pop along to spiritualawakeningsinternational.org. We look forward to connecting with you at the conference, but in the meantime, let's get back to listening to Dr. Yvonne Kason.
So what ended up happening, and again, I'll abbreviate just for the sake of time, is that the pilot really, really heroically managed to do sort of a guided belly landing with the wheels up on the surface of the ice of the lake. And really, we would have been okay, except the ice was too thin. And as soon as the plane came to a stop, its weight broke the surface of the ice, and the plane nosedived and very rapidly sunk into very deep water. So we had to get out of the plane really, really quickly while it was sinking. The nurse, the pilot, and I managed to get out of the plane. We tried with all of our might to get the patient up. We were not able to. She went down with the plane when it nosedived. And then I found myself in open water, and it's the middle of winter, freezing weather, heavy storm. The plane had actually skidded across a semi-frozen lake right to the edge of open water in a place called Devil's Gap.
Oh, what a name.
Devil's Gap, Lake of the Woods near Kenora. And it's called Devil's Gap because the ice is so thin there and the water is so treacherous year round because of the strong current. So there was this water with a really, really strong current that was separating us from the closest land. And so in order to try and get to land, we had to swim a long distance, about 200 yards, wearing heavy winter clothes, parkas, boots, snow boots that were just pulling us down like dead weights in freezing weather. I mean, my hands were numb from the cold within a minute or so. And the voice in my head said, swim to shore. Now, the pilot was going, try to get on the ice, try to get on the ice. And, I guess because I was inexperienced in spiritual experiences, I argued with the voice in my head, I'm not going to swim to shore. It's too far. I'm not going to be able to make
As we do. Yeah.
And so I tried to get on the ice, but the ice was too thin and I would be wasting all sorts of energy, kicking, trying to get my arms up on the ice. And as soon as the weight, even of my arms was there, poof, the ice would break and sink down. Yeah. And I was getting more tired and colder. And the voice kept repeating, swim to shore. So finally, about the third time, I gave in to the voice and I surrendered, which I now hopefully I'll surrender to inner wisdom without having to have it need to be repeated 3 times. and I started swimming to shore. And it was a really long and a really, really difficult swim. And I went under several times, got lake water in my lungs and had to kick and kick and kick to bring my mouth above water again and try and get some air. And many people say it's a miracle that I was able to swim that distance in those conditions and in heavy winter clothes. I was a very strong swimmer at that age, thank goodness. Anyway, somewhere in the process of swimming to shore is when my near-death experience deepened. And then what happened was all of a sudden, again, I heard that roaring sound and it was like, and then I found myself 20 or 30 feet above my body, looking down, watching what was happening. But, it was not that straightforward because I was still alive. I was still swimming to shore. So it was actually like my consciousness was two places at the same time. Yeah. And how I describe it, it's like a split screen TV. I mean, everyone's used to that now with Zoom and everything, how you can have a little tiny picture and then a big picture. Yep. So it was like my consciousness was two places at the same time. The little tiny picture was a little bit of my consciousness that was still in my body that was swimming to shore, desperately trying to swim this long distance to shore. But the main part of my consciousness had risen and was above my body and was now, it felt like 20 or 30 feet above my body. And then I rose even higher. And I went into this realm or place that was filled with light. It was like being on the insides of a cloud, just, if you're ever in a plane going up and the sunlight shining above the clouds just before you break through, where it's all light and sprinkly and soft and beautiful white light. That's what it was like. I went into, it was just beautiful, beautiful white light realm. But what was the most powerful thing for me was not the light. It was the love that I was feeling. I just felt this incredible, powerful, unconditional love. I mean, it was like being home. It was like being complete. It was that everything was right with the universe. And I knew things when I was in this realm of light and love. For an instant, I saw a face of light, like in the periphery, and then it seemed to fade into, cloud-like, if you want to call it, periphery. But it was not a face that I recognized, but, a benevolent sort of face. But I didn't hear like words, or I wasn't being taught through words. I just somehow knew things. And somehow, inexplicably, it's impossible to explain how I knew, but I knew that this love that I was feeling was the love of the higher power, or what I had been raised to call God. And how I was experiencing God was not at all like what I had been taught God was supposed to be like. It was not like an old man with a long white beard sitting on a throne, judging if you've been good, if you've been bad, with a big book in front of him or something. No, that was not at all what I was experiencing. What I was experiencing God or the higher power to be was like this immense, vast, omnipresent, stretching throughout and permeating all of creation, like a force field of love and infinite intelligence that was like underlying, interpenetrating all of everything, all of creation and uncreated. And that I knew too that what I think of as me would still live on, whether my physical body down there that was still trying to swim to shore lived or died. And I felt complete joy, complete love, complete at home. And it really didn't matter to me whether my physical body down there lived or died, because I was home and I was totally loved and just permeated with perfect love. And if I compare the love I felt when I was meditating to the that experience I told you about with my Kundalini awakening, to what I experienced this day in what I now know was a near-death experience, I would say you can hardly even put them on the same scale. It was 1,000 times greater when I was in the realm of light compared to what I experienced when I was meditating. It was like perfect unconditional love, just complete. And so anyway, I watched with detachment as my physical body continued to swim to shore. And the way I describe it to people is it's sort of like if you're watching a television show, you know the ending's already been determined. You really don't care, but you're just sort of curious to see how did they make it end, right?
Yeah.
So it was with that sort of detachment I was watching. Okay, God knows what's going to happen. How's this one going to end? And so I was watching what was happening down below, really not caring because I was just so at peace and so in joy and just basking in that divine love and being home and like being at the mother's breast, there I was, I had no need to leave, it's just, I was home. And I'm a new grandmother. So my son and his wife is nursing the baby. And that's what I'm experiencing the pure joy a little baby has when it's nursing with mama. And, that's a good analogy. That's how it felt. Like I was exactly where I was meant to be. This was my place. I had no need to be anywhere else. Oh, what's that body doing down there? Is it going to live?
Wow.
So anyway, through a whole bunch of miracles and coincidences, and just for time, I'm not going to share all of them right now. I did manage to swim to shore, and so did the pilot. The nurse managed to find some wood that had some wood that was frozen in some ice, so it was enough to keep her afloat. And a helicopter, which is the only vehicle that could possibly have rescued us because of the location that we were at. And normally there's no helicopter in this part of the world, but there happened to be that day, and it happened to set down just 5 miles from we crashed. And the SOS message that the pilot sent out when we crashed could only be heard by a plane directly overhead because of all of the hills. But there just happened to be a plane directly overhead, like high overhead, that relayed the radio message down. I mean, all of these coincidences, to me, it was the divine hand orchestrated so many coincidences, miracles, synchronicities, and that the two helicopter pilots, they went out, looked for us, they found us, they risked their lives to save us, and they brought us by helicopter to the closest hospital. I remember watching from above as they landed the helicopter on the driveway of the hospital, and then the emergency room staff, they came running out with their little stretchers, right? And they put me on a stretcher, wheeled me into the emergency department. And I remember watching from above when a nurse was trying to take my temperature with the thermometer. And she stuck the thermometer in my mouth, and then she took it out. She was looking at the reading, and she's really puzzled because of shaking the thermometer. Why was she not getting a reading? Well, I was hypothermic, which means I was freezing to death. And my body temperature was below the bottom reading on her thermometer, which was because she was just using a standard thermometer, which was why she could not get a reading. And I could feel my consciousness drifting further and further away from my body. And I knew I was dying, but that was fine. I was totally at peace with dying.
It's fine.
So I was at peace with dying. And then I was surprised to hear somebody say, boy, could I use a hot bath. And I was really startled to see that those words had come out of my body's mouth, because I had not thought of those words, but somehow those words were spoken through my mouth. Boy, could I use a hot bath. And then and it turns out that's exactly what we needed. We needed to be rapidly rewarmed, and by submerging us in hot water would rewarm us and revive us, was the best thing that our bodies needed. So some divine wisdom spoke through my mouth. And then the nurses looked at each other and said, gee, maybe that'll help us. Let's help them. Let's take them to the physiotherapy department, which they did. And they finally took off our ice encrusted clothes and then put me in the hot whirlpool bath. And then it's in the hot water, when my body was being reheated, is when my consciousness finally re-entered my body.
I'm sure you can appreciate there's so much more to Dr. Yvonne's story than we've been able to cover today. We're going to wrap this episode up here in the meantime, but do join us in the next episode where we have part 2 with Dr. Yvonne Kason. She's going to be sharing that last near-death experience that she had, what that was like for her, what she learnt from that. We're going to hear about her choice as to whether she came into her existing body that she had left from, or whether it was a different body entirely. We're going to learn what it was like for Yvonne to live with a traumatic brain injury, the spontaneous healing that took place from that injury. And we're going to touch on purpose, Kundalini, and all sorts of spiritual experiences. Be sure to join us for part 2 with Dr. Yvonne Kason in our next episode of the Let's Talk Near-Death podcast. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Let's Talk Near-Death podcast. Don't forget you can join the free online community over at www.letstalkneardeath.com, and I look forward to sharing another episode with you soon.